My name is Lauren Kaplan. I'm a mixed methods UX researcher focused on AI.
Welcome back to the MLOps Community podcast. I am your host, Demetrios, and today I'm happy as a lark because we confirmed Thomas Wolfe, the co-founder of Hugging Face, will be in person with me in Amsterdam for the AI Agents in Production virtual conference. Don't let that in-person part that I just said confuse you. We're going to be streaming live from a really cool museum in Amsterdam. If you want to come, hit me up. But you don't have to be in Amsterdam to enjoy the fun. That's right. It's all going to be in the internet, on the internet, everywhere that you can find a web page, we will be there. And the specific web page to register for the AI Agents in Production conference on November 13th will be in the description below. Highly encourage it. We've got Thomas Wolfe, co-founder of Hugging Face, as one of our keynotes, and he is just one of 30 incredible speakers. I don't want to waste your time naming them all off, but they're good. And I'm trying really hard to just talk to you about the conversation I just had with Lauren. This conversation was all about UX research. And she has a bit of experience with this because she worked on PyTorch as a UX researcher to know how to just make that framework and that open source project excel. And I think they did a pretty good job. So we go through what it means to be a UX researcher, why it's important, why we should even be thinking about this, and how, if you have a UX researcher at your disposal, should you interface with them? How can you be a good stakeholder in the research? Let's jump into it with Lauren. And as always, if you enjoy this podcast, just share it with one friend. That's all I ask. We have to set the scene. I want to know what user experience research is and the TLDR of the space and what you've been up to.
All right, so I think starting with the first piece is generally the process of getting insights into how people are interacting with an experience, which that can be a product. We can just start there and really interested in their perspective in terms of their needs, their pain points, their motivations with that. Secondly, it was what am I...
What have you been up to?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess there's some background into what I've worked on, right? In the past, worked at Facebook AI, which turned into Meta, working on research for PyTorch and also on privacy preserving machine learning. And then most recently, I've been at an AI chip startup, and right now, sort of exploring other opportunities.
Nice. So there is something that I think about when it comes to user experience research, and that is the typical way that I feel like it gets done, which is kind of, as you mentioned, folks sitting together, trying to explore where there's pain points, where there's friction. Does that just mean that the job is you watching people do their jobs?
There's different methods, right? So I think what you just mentioned is sort of thinking of what you call kind of qualitative, right? You can do things called a contextual inquiry where you're going where people are actually using a product and sitting down with them and observing them. But you can also do things more quantitatively, right? You can collect data, even analyzing it with some machine learning tools now, right? Doing sentiment analysis or analyzing behavioral data and linking that up with surveys and that sort of a thing. So there's a big range of approaches you can use to get insight into what people need and what they're doing.
Yeah, I can see that. So you have a lot of tools in your tool belt to try to ultimately make the experience as painless as possible. Do you feel like there are certain things that have worked better for you in your past that have given you or like helped you gain those insights?
I think it's very like context specific, right? Because you have to start on like, and that's what like I think with like maybe the workflow for a researcher, right? Is like really defining like what is the problem that you're tackling, like identifying all of your stakeholders, and like that's all of the context that goes into it. Like who are you actually including in the research and why? And like what would people even feel comfortable with? Like in the past, some of the topics I focused on, people were pretty private about, right? So some methods like, hey, let me sit and follow you at Google while you're working on some confidential projects, like no one's gonna do that, right? But will they maybe do, not saying anyone was necessarily from Google in my research, but maybe they'd feel more comfortable doing an interview, right? Where they are clear on like, hey, like these are your rights as a researcher. You don't have to talk about this or that. Like this is going to be anonymized. There's a lot of like privacy concerns for people sometimes or generally, and also like best practices as a researcher that you have to follow that will also kind of shape what you can do.
The other thing that, as you were talking about, hey, I would love to have someone get to the end of an interview and say, wow, that was amazing. I want to do more with you. What are you thinking about as you're trying to prep questions or you're trying to like go deeper? Is it just trying to ask someone to tell you about their pains when using a product, or when like, where does the product not hold up? Is it feature requests?
So I think we're getting kind of like into like what the goals of like what the insights you're trying to get, right? So before you even get to the point where you're doing, let's say, I'm just going to anchor in an interview, you've already ideally like met with all your stakeholders internally. You're very clear on like what the impact, like everything should be very solution oriented. What is the impact of doing this research? Why are we doing it? Who do we want to talk to and why? This is what we're going to focus on this work. And then when we sit down, you start to create what's called like an interview guide, right? And ideally, in like a successful collaboration, right, with, you'll work with engineers, designers, product, depending on the team, the company you're with. And ideally, like a really good collaboration between an engineer and a researcher would be like they're giving you feedback in that doc, right? They're being very engaged, like, hey, we want to know about this. Or you draft out a question to like, yeah, we want to get like drilled down into, I don't know, like what percent, what does it mean to have like a good experience with like their inferencing, or like they just give like very specific feedback. Because if you don't give specific feedback and you don't engage with a researcher, you're gonna get like really high level results and you're not going to be happy. You're gonna say, well, why do we do all of this work? It's just all high level. And so in order to have like really targeted insights, you need a lot of engagement and collaboration. And I think that's what I saw at Meta that was very positive was the engineers were just like super engaged. Like if you left to dock with them, you'd see like hundreds of people like commenting. So that's a really positive sign, like, and positive way to work when you're a researcher. If you don't have that, it's going to be tough.
And do you think at Meta you saw that because folks could see the outcomes of the research? They would see a product or a experience that they were having get better. And so it's almost like, it's easier for me to pay taxes in Germany because the roads are really smooth. And so I see my taxes at work in a way.
I think so. And I think also the engineering teams like had experience working with researchers. So even if they hadn't worked with you, they might have worked with someone else. I also think the culture was just really strong. It was very open, like no stupid questions, right? Because as like from my background being a sociologist, and then I remember like one of my first projects there, like really going deep into AI, and I was a little intimidated, right? But I had to like dive in and like learn really more deeply about the topic. And something that was really positive was like, I remember like drafting out an analysis and like sitting down with the products and engineering lead And like, I'd have like a couple questions and they'd be like, yeah, that's a total reasonable question because that's an internal tool you would have never even known about, right? Like, hey, you're asking good questions. And I think having that culture of like encouraging people to learn is really important as well, because especially now that AI has grown so much, I feel like more and more researchers are going to have to onboard onto AI. And so not everyone like has that experience yet. So that was a
Yeah.
bit of a ramble, but
And one thing that you told me was that UX or user experience can be a much broader thing than just like product. And what exactly does that mean?
yeah. So the reason I started like this like working definition with product is because I feel like it's the more traditional and more concrete thing that people think of. But in reality, I think you're working much more broad than that. Like, for example, you might be, as a researcher, working on understanding people's experiences, like, of like, for example, with AI, like, how do we even communicate about AI to consumers? Or how do we meet the needs of, like, what's the developer community and what do they need? Or like, what are the ways that like an AI framework can be competitive with other AI frameworks, and how can we, what are people really working on when it comes to different model architectures, or what language support do we need? Like, it becomes like very broad in that sense. And then I also feel like researchers will cover not only product research, but also things like market research. So like, you might not necessarily have someone who's just like a dedicated market researcher, because maybe your marketing team is like, you know, tied up with other things. So like in my work, I've done work that it's impacting on both the engineering side, but also for marketing as well, right? So there's like a pretty broad set of stakeholders that you need to make happy. I think that there might be, you know, some folks that are more focused on like the design component, but my work has been a bit more broad than that.
And when you're doing this market research, are you pulling from sources that you yourself did not create? Like, are you just trying to get information from anywhere? Going back to the interview or surveys, that is what you probably have a technical term for it, but I would consider that's like something that you've created, data that you created while doing the research. But then you can go out and you can look into communities like the MLOps community and kind of see what's the sentiment around this. And so that's not necessarily data that you've created, but you're still researching it, and you're almost like letting your tentacles go out into the world and then bring back things that are of relevance to this research.
Yeah, it's like primary, I think the right term would be like primary and secondary research. So primary is like when you're like collecting your own data, and then secondary, you're kind of leveraging existing data sets in a way. So I guess you could say the discourse on like the MLOps community, like channels, could be an existing data source, which I guarantee you many researchers are super interested in your community, right? I think that either way, you need to be systematic. And this is the thing, is that you have to always anchor again and like, what is the impact? Why are we doing this? You have a plan, like your workflow would be, you have your like research plan, you're working through that with your stakeholders. And if there's going to be a marketing component, then your marketing stakeholders are there and they give their voice and their opinion of what they want. And then also the engineering team is going to be there giving their voice and opinion of what they need. And then you have to come to an alignment from the beginning before you even start, because that's going to shape the type of data you're trying to get. And it'll deeper into also how you're going to design things, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And in that plan, are you mapping out different hypotheses?
You can do that, or you can like generally, like every plan should have like your questions or research questions, right? And so there's a difference between your research questions, which are like the broader goals of what you want to learn, and then like the questions you actually, let's say, ask people in a survey or an interview. Those like separate. I notice people kind of mix those together.
Yeah. And so this is pre going out there and starting the research. Then afterwards, once you've gathered all this data and you are working through it, one thing that I found, especially when we did just a the surveys within the MLOps community, which I would say is very, very adolescent compared to the stuff that you've done, I had the hardest time synthesizing the data and going through and drawing conclusions. And so I don't know if you have advice on how to go about, okay, I've gone through and I've done this, I have this plan, and here's all the different stakeholders and what they're looking for and their needs. And I've gathered all this data, and now how do I connect all those dots?
That's a really important skill for a researcher to have. I think that something that helps is you could have something like an analysis plan so that like when you're actually going through the data, you at the outset sort of know like how you're going to be using it. So I'm trying to think of how to describe it. Like, for example, let's say you're like, don't have a lot of budget and you're like using even a Google form, right? To like basic questions, regardless of what you're using. Let's say you're using that and you can only ask a few questions, right? Because you want to have people spending 20 minutes answering questions. Every single thing you ask needs to be strategic and mapped to what you're looking for. So that when you have your data collected, you have a plan. Like, let's say you're looking at MLOps community, like, hey, I want to know like people's backgrounds in terms of like what roles they are. Like, are they looking for work? What's their biggest challenges in finding that? Like, how do they feel about the content of my podcast? Like, you would plan all of that in advance so that once you get the data, you already have a plan of like how you're going to analyze that data and the like patterns that you're generally looking for. And sometimes like the data might surprise you and you'll get something you weren't anticipating, but at least you're going in a systematic way. And I think also the types of questions the way you frame them, right? You can have like structured, right? Let's say you're looking for like, hey, I want to get a sense of like the overall, like, I don't know, satisfaction with my community, right? You can ask a question that to like, calculate a mean or something like that. But then you can also design a question that's more open-ended, and you could either like manually like open code that to see what's going on. But you could also like couple it with like a pre-trained model to analyze it and see how it works.
Yeah.
I've done that as well.
I'm always paranoid that the people that fill out these surveys, they're the ones, if they're taking the time to fill it out, they're going to give me more or less good reviews on it of how they feel about the community because they spend the time to do it. And so it's like, how can I get those folks that aren't taking the time and the diverse opinions, right? Like, how do you cover the robustness of the data that you're collecting?
Yeah, like that's definitely a good point because you're kind of getting into like bias, right? There's like a social desirability bias there where people are going to be more engaged saying more positive things. I mean, some ways you can do that is try to incentivize people by like giving them, gift cards or something that maybe someone who maybe even they're not as engaged, like, hey, cool, I can get a $25 gift card. I guess I'll do it. Could help kind of get more people to respond, but it can be challenging. And like even now, there was a study that came out. It's not peer reviewed yet, I don't think, but they actually like analyzed one of these commercial platforms where people are doing research, and like 35% of the responses were they found that people were actually using AI to help them just fill out the surveys to get their like money. So like that's
Free stuff. Yeah.
So that's like a whole nother thing because that's going to affect methods. Because like I think something that researchers have in common, or like UX researchers have in common with like AI researchers and also like that kind of community, is like we have to think about things like missing data, like is there a bias to that, and like accounting for all these technical components. And so if we're having people use AI to write their questions, use AI to respond to the questions, like how do you handle that data? And I don't think there's an answer right now, and there kind of needs to be an answer. We need to know how to like handle data.
So let's go over some scenarios and like why we should care about this, right? And maybe you have a few examples of things that we could look at from the ML and AI lens.
Okay. I think like one example would be if you are like one obvious one for like an ML engineer is like if you are deploying models and you have a like a user researcher who's like focused on understanding like developer tools, like that person is going to be able to like bring a voice to the pain points you've been having. And you can point to that and say, yes, see, we do need support for this to make this easier for people. So like I think that's one very clear place where it can be a strong partnership and benefit to people.
And that's always fascinating because what I'm hearing you say, especially in that pre-data gathering phase, when you have to have your plan in place, is you really want to know what the impact is going to be. Have you been able to measure impact in like monetary ways? Is that the most impactful way of putting it for someone? To say, look, if we do XYZ, it's going to save us or make us millions and millions of dollars or billions, right? Or it's going to, are you doing it more in ways that are a few steps down from money that you can kind of extrapolate out? Like, hey, if we can save time on the deployment process or have our ML engineers dealing with deployment processes less, that is going to save money in the form of their salary and also in the iteration speed that we can get models out, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think that organizations are generally driven by efficiency. So I do think that the efficiency argument definitely is useful for organizations. Of course, yeah, like the monetary component can be there and is definitely convincing if you have like $1 billion problem that you can show like that you've made like a 4% difference on is pretty big for companies as well. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of like the work that I have done is like really focusing on like actually understanding like the ML engineering workflow. So, and I think a big part of the reason of that is I'm trying to be mindful of like what I can say, but it's like, it's really, really important. I hope like community members like know, like if you're not having like a good experience, people aren't going to use like your products and they're going to switch over to something else. Um,
Yeah.
and so you have to find as a researcher the synergy between what's good for a company and what's good for the people who are using their products. And you have to advocate for that and find that balance.
Okay, so you're gathering this information. Ideally, you're tying it to a monetary number, but efficiency is also a great number that is going to get you far. And workplaces tend to understand that gain and that trade-off. Are there other, I'm not going to say buzzwords, but just like words or things that you could anchor on that is going to help folks understand the value of, if we do this research and we are able to create an impact in X way, whatever it is, efficiency gain or monetary gain or blank, then it's worth it for us to do that research.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, it's funny because this is actually like a big topic among researchers is like, how do you measure impacts? How do you track impact of research?
I imagine.
Yeah, I think that like another component could be like more anchoring and just, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but things like that show that you have like a very intuitive product that people are enjoying using and understanding like what are the strengths of what you're offering and where are the gaps so that you can maintain like being competitive. That's very valuable. And I think in AI, people know, like if you're in a very AI driven organization, how valuable that is. I don't know if that's getting into tracking the impacts, but I think that might just be more into the value of understanding people's needs. I think also just like companies really struggle, I think, to understand who their audience even is. So I think if you're able to get insight into people at a really like a deeper level, it's super valuable for teams, right? To know like who are users. Like a lot of
Yeah.
companies actually don't know that, or who are our customers. And they're trying to
Yeah.
struggle and figure that out as AI is changing, which it changes very quickly. And so you have to cover, like if you're focused on like a products, like for example, PyTorch, you have to be focused on like the entire, for me, it felt like all domains. Are you doing video? Are you doing speech? What languages are you using? Like it's super broad. And so you have to be able to like really prioritize and like go both broad and deep to, I think, really give a signal that's like accurate and useful for people. That's going to be good for like potentially even like a couple of years. Like you'll be good. You'll like know who your audience is for a while. But now things are moving even faster, so you might need to do it more often. But
How did you prioritize?
I think by having really strong partners is super useful to help me to prioritize, right? Like what is important to them and why, and then taking that as a whole and putting that together. It's almost like you're doing internal synthesis or analysis of your stakeholders in a way to be able to figure out what you really need. And it can be really hard. Actually, you ask good questions because, well, of course you ask a good question. Have a good podcast. But I think that that's something that people really struggle with too, is like, especially when you're a researcher that comes, I think, from like like my background, like having a PhD, like you're used to doing these like really broad, deep, comprehensive studies. But in industry, you have to move a lot faster. You're going to have to make trade-offs. You're going to have to streamline it. So you can't cover as much as you want. And you might walk away feeling, even if everyone thinks you did an awesome job, feeling like, I guess it was good enough. So it is a struggle that researchers have. Like sometimes you just have to like cut certain things out, and I like don't like to say like ruthlessly prioritize, but like sometimes you have to do that, right? In some ways you do that as like maybe you pilot what you're doing and you realize like, you know what, like this just doesn't, or you learn, sometimes you don't learn until you're done and you share insights and you're like, yeah, I thought that people would really care about X topic, but actually, yeah, no, that was a waste of time. Next time, lesson learned.
It feels like potentially some of that could be combated by having almost like a 3-phase rollout, or, hey, we're going to go out there and phase 1 is we're going to try and validate this assumption. And then when we have a little bit of data, we're going to go into phase 2, which is playing or building off of that assumption. Do you tend to set up projects in that way at all, or not?
Yes, actually, a lot of my work has been like multi-phased work, right? So you say, hey, you know, first phase, we're going to do like a pilot based on like whatever your situation. Let's say you start off with like a survey, right? Okay. And then after we get that, we're going to go and dive deeper into, I don't know, let's say like ML, like model monitoring, let's say.
Yeah.
And we'll do a deep dive with that. But first we want to get a sense of like what models people are using, or like getting more context into who they are. And so you sort of plan things out that way, and that helps you to like cover more grounds as well. And it can also help for you to see like what's working versus not. Like, hey, yeah, we asked some of these things in the first phase, but what actually we can refine those questions even more. So you're actually spot on with that.
Yeah, because you don't want to spend 6 months only to realize, oh, we're not asking the right questions. And now we recognize that, which probably still happens even with these phases, that you gain this insight. I really like how you say that, is that you gain an insight after everything's all done. But that insight is probably so valuable, even if it is the insight that you were completely wrong.
Yeah. And I think that you don't really even have that amount of time realistically. Like, I think in the past, you might be doing like more foundational research, which is work that you do when there's like not really any research in your problem space and there's just like a really broad scope. So with like those type of projects in the past, I feel like researchers were given resources to do those, and they'd maybe have a quarter, like 3 months to get them done, and that would be considered a long time frame. Now I feel like researchers are doing things, so maybe now I'm getting to a different topic, but then there's also like more iterative research where you have like some understanding, but you're iterating on like a certain experience, right? So you might be doing like have a couple weeks. And then I see it going down to like I've had things where it's like, can I have it in a couple of days? And so I actually think that, kind of going on a tangent, but like I think AI moves really quickly. I think everyone's workflows have been like organizations are just really making things very efficient. And so I think that the efficiency pressures that engineering teams have been facing have also like trickled into other people's workflows where we're all just working super, super quickly and have less time to do our work. And so you have to be able to learn and iterate very, very quickly in your work. And that was always important, but I think it's like even more important now. And that's why I think the collaboration piece between different people and different functions is so important, because without that, it can take longer to even figure out you're not going in the right direction.
God, but the value prop there is so nice when you talk about, hey, can we have some kind of a question and get some early signals in a few days? That is really powerful to be able to go back and say, there's worth us spending time on this problem, or no, we weren't able to do it, so we can double down and spend more time, like spend another week on it, trying to see if there are signals, or we can just leave it and have it be something that we tried and then we'll table it for now. There is something else that I think is worth talking about, and that's like, you've been working at gigantic companies and then startups. And the thing that I have been wondering as we're having this conversation that's been going on in my head is, I see the value of having a researcher. I would love to have a researcher that I could have on the team, because I have so many questions, and it would be great to be able to say, like, can we go and find signal? Is there anything there? Or am I just hallucinating this, right? But it feels like the user experience researchers that I know are all at big companies. Have you seen that trend where it is more of a big company type of role?
It's hard because actually, like, speaking of data, like I just feel like I see like these like anecdotal data of like what's going on in terms of the user experience, like research, like what's the market and what's going on, because people like struggling to really land roles right now, and like they want to kind of know like what's going on. So it's kind of hard to like say concrete things. Um,
Do you feel like there is when it comes to this user research, it is really interesting to look at this idea of you're researching a product versus you are researching a framework per se. When we're in the developer sphere, right, there's like the end product that a user is using that uses AI maybe, or there is some developer tool, be that a framework, that a developer is using. And do those two worlds differ that much, or where do they have their overlap? Like, what does that Venn diagram look like?
I mean, I could start with like the framework piece. I think I kind of touched on it before, where it's like you have to cover a lot of ground in terms of what's going on in AI and like understanding people's workflows and really deeply understanding what they need. I think like the more like B2C, like let's like build something on top of ChatGPT, and then we'll have, I don't know, like a recruiting tool, a tool for recruiters to automate their like thing. Like that might be a bit different, where like you might be doing like shorter like design sprints and have some iteration of the product, and maybe your scope might be a little bit more narrow and like focused in on like a very specific niche area, which can be useful in a way because it could help you to prioritize. But then there can also be a lot of challenges in terms of like alignment. Like I was talking to a company, an enterprise company, and they were working to like integrate AI right into their products. And like, I was like really surprised to hear, it's like kind of sad to hear. It's like, yeah, sometimes we do research here and like the product's already launched and nothing gets integrated. And actually we're using this AI model. And when people ask a question to this model, it just says, I don't know. It's like, okay. And like, so I'm kind of going in circles in a way, I feel. But I feel like the challenge, what I was trying to get to is like this alignment, because I was like, oh yeah, well, are you talking to engineering? They're like, no, we don't talk to engineering. Like, okay, so you're creating a product that's built with AI, but no one's talking to engineering. It sounds like an issue, right? Big issue. So I feel like, I don't know. It also will be very organizational dependent and like how advanced like people are in terms of like both research and AI and just like their processes at the company. And like, I think a lot of companies are actually really struggling unless they're in the lead of like, how do we integrate AI into our products? Because they feel like they need to do that to stay competitive, but they don't actually know enough about.
You don't even have to finish that sentence. I know exactly what you mean. And that's how I've been feeling. And funny enough, I wrote this whole talk because I was going to a conference last week and I thought I had a talk. Turns out I didn't have a talk. I had a fireside chat. So I didn't need to spend the 6 hours on the plane to the conference frantically trying to write this talk and being like, is this good enough? I don't know. There needs to be more substance here. And the talk was all about how, in my eyes, the best strategy right now for companies that are not on the full cutting edge, like not your Google Meta type companies, but companies that you were just mentioning that feel pressure to implement AI in any way, shape, or form, but they don't have the understanding, or maybe they don't have the culture, and they think they can just skip over all of the data foundations. In my eyes, the best strategy for them is to play the patience game, because in 1 or 2 years, it's going to be a lot easier and it's going to be a lot more clear for what use cases are really effective and what ways you can leverage AI. So that's like from a high level, but then from the engineering level, all of these frameworks will kind of shake out, and you'll have 1 or 2 or 3 that are very used and there's a lot of support for, and the community has kind of rallied around. So that's going to be easier for the engineers, because right now you have this sprawl that's happening. And so maybe you choose this one, and then in a year or two, it turns out that company got bought by another company and they got discontinued. And so you have to do a whole lift and shift or whatever. And so those were a few of my arguments, we could say, as to why it might be better just to, I don't want to use the word do a fast follow, but really be patient and almost like a cat that's waiting for that mouse, like pounce when the time is right, but don't just pounce because you can.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like they're doing like the latter and like tying it back, I think, to research. Like that's why research is valuable, right? Like companies like tech leading companies have already like done research to know the direction that these things are going to go to a certain extent. And I can't like say too much about that, but I mean, if you take the time to invest and to understand, okay, we want to implement again our AI for recruiting or AI for HR. I've seen a lot of few companies doing that with enterprise, right? Like how do we make our talent pipeline and people who are working at the company? It's like you have to really sit down and understand like what are the use cases at this specific company. I might be using use cases in a different way than you right now, but like what are the like top like 4 use cases we want to prioritize, for example?
Exactly.
And like what support are we going to need to actually implement it, like on the engineering side? And all of that is stuff that like you can do with research, right? Like, oh, do we want to prioritize support for PyTorch? I feel like this answer is going to be yes for that generally. But
Yeah.
there's other like pieces too, like what cloud service providers are people using? And like I feel a lot of empathy for engineering community because it's like I get targeted with these things all the time. It's like be a cloud engineer. And then I'm okay, your like syllabus, like what are you offering to teach me? It's like, well, you're gonna learn, Google Cloud. And it's like, well, okay, well, what if you want to use different cloud? It's like, oh, never mind. You have to learn this. Like, well, what are the commonalities like across those experiences that would like make it easier for people to like switch between these different tools, right? It's like going on topic, but I think it's really like a lot of companies don't have an understanding of like AI infrastructure and how to
Yeah.
build that and what's going to be in-house versus not. And so I don't know what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where you get my favorite job title ever, which is like Center of AI Excellence. And I feel like that's their job, is to go and figure out, all right, how can we implement AI? What are the top use cases here? And so despite having the funny name, there is some value in that. But the other piece that I was wondering about when you were talking about how there's these research projects that you have, and sometimes they're going to be very broad, and then other times it's going to be like super pointed and very short-lived. How would you kind of juxtapose the two? How much weight is it going to take us to actually put this research project out there, or like gather all the data and then go through all the motions, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I feel like you're asking questions about like prioritizing and like balancing research. And it's funny because that's often like an interview question. It's like,
Oh, yeah.
tell me how you like prioritize, these different things. I mean, I think ultimately it also has like, it's hard to answer it without context, but like, let's say you're in a company where they haven't done research before. I feel like you'll find yourself maybe saying yes more often to some of these like shorter, like iterative, narrow focused things because you're trying to build trust with folks and do things, and that you're not going to be a burden. You're not going to be moving too slow. But at the same time, you have to also like be meeting with leadership and across the company to understand like, yes, we're doing these like iterative smaller things, but bigger picture, what we really need to know is this. We don't know, let's say, who our audience is, or like what our market actually is, or like we don't know what tools people are actually using. We don't know like how can we meet, I don't know, with model survey. It's a big pain point. How can we make that easier for folks? Like you have to be able to execute and advocate at the same time as a researcher. And I think that's pretty challenging. And then also layered on top of that, you have what we mentioned before, which is like tracking the impact. So you have sort of like executing, then landing your research, which is like really like sharing it out to different stakeholders. Like, hey, these are the insights we found. Here's the supporting data. These are the recommendations. These are the solutions. And then you have to, after you're landing it, it's almost like monitoring like what's happened since then while like keeping the next things moving.
And it sounds like it's a bit of education that you have to do, like from your side to leadership, to help them understand what the impact is. Have you seen that, or is it a two-way street where sometimes it's like leadership is telling you what the impact is, and so it's very clear?
I think it's like a bit of a mix, but I feel like it's almost more like you actually, as a researcher, sometimes have to really explain what you even do in the first place. Like, I feel like
Like this call, just send them this podcast. That's all.
I don't know. I mean, it depends
Yeah.
how I want to see it after. I wonder how it's coming out. But I mean, part of because when you invited me, I was like, hey, like, is this going to be valuable to people? Like, what do we want? Like, as outcomes, it's like, it'd be helpful to have some clarity of to like, what do we actually do? How can we collect another for like the ultimate goal of like improving like our work for one another in a context where everyone's struggling and like taking on sometimes like the job of 3 different people across different functions.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of which, you mentioned how engineering, especially when you were at Meta, they were great partners. are there certain things that you look for or that are like green flags with a partner when you're going and you're trying to get this research done? What are things besides them being very enthusiastic on a doc?
Well, I think when I see things like in terms of like, are they active in like getting feedback? Are they are they engaged like with external communities, right? Like, are they like parts of like, are they contributing to open source communities? Like, that's also like a signal that they really want to stay close and connected, right, with users. So that's definitely a very important piece. And I feel like engineers are actually like can be very good at that, right? Like when you're doing well with with a team and an engineer goes out and gets feedback, what you're going to hear is going to be really close to what you're finding with your research, because there's just such a strong connection between the engineering team and like the external audience. And so like that's powerful to have, because then the engineers also will see the value of like, yeah, like of course we need to stay close to what people are doing, and we need partners and like resources to do that. So like they see you as a resource and they have that hunger and appetite to like mutually succeed together, right?
And you create the tangible assets from these research projects, but then how do you make sure that something is actioned on them? Or is it kind of out of your hands once you've created that? It's like, yeah, I've done my part, because I know you mentioned before where there was that disconnect. There was the user research team, but then nobody was doing anything with any of the stuff that they were creating.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't work there, so I don't know what's going on exactly at that.
Sounds dysfunctional. Yeah.
Yeah, well, something's, they're just facing challenges, and there were some really great people that I talked to. So, I don't want to like say anything negative, but I think a lot of it's just organizational. And like, that's why, like, I think part of what we had planned to talk about too was like, when does research succeed versus not? And it's like organizational. And then there's also like components of like, as a researcher, like, are you going into a situation where there's like what we would say if there's like a high maturity and awareness of what you actually do? Or are you going into a situation where there's a very low awareness and understanding of what you do and having to like build all of that up? Because if you're going into a situation where the research maturity is high, I feel like you have a lot more potential to have impacts, because you've already established this function, right? Among the other like organizational factors that have to have alignment, right? And also it depends too, because it can be a mix of like top-down thinking, where it's like, executive, there's only so much you're going to be able to change, or you're just kind of going with what they need, versus like bottom up. And so there's, I think, also dynamics with that within organizations to navigate as well.
When you've seen low maturity in this field, are there things that you feel like can help bring the maturity up? Is it just a matter of time and more experiences with the user experience researchers, or are there other things that we can do?
Yeah, I mean, I think one piece is like, as a researcher, if you're in that context, you almost have like a second job of like doing a lot of extra work to really make sure that you're like meeting with people throughout the company, like aligning on like what they need and what's important to them, explaining what you do at a level that you might never have had to do before. You might even like be building up the operations for the company as well, and trying to convince your stakeholders of like the value of investing in having like platforms to even be able to do your work. And you're going to have to be able to really explain things in ways that you, like, repeating myself, you haven't had to do before. And so I think when it comes down to it, it's also the same thing with products and with AI. Like, people don't engage unless there's trust. And so I think Exceed, you need to be in the right fit for a company, and they have to be the right fit for you ultimately. Like, you can do all of that work, but if people don't have that trust through collaborating with you over time, then it's like a good signal to like move on, but there's definitely, you need to be very patient, self-reflective, and empathetic of like, hey, not everyone's going to know what I think is this very simple thing, and I need to explain it and why it's important, and just be very patient, I think, is the advice that I would give to a researcher. But I realize like this audience is not necessarily researchers. But I think the collaboration piece and working closely is important. And I think it's been really challenging because like some organizations just had a lot of infrastructure, like with like, the pandemic when they went remote, that they just had like strong culture and collaboration, whereas other companies didn't. So like any work is gonna suffer if you don't have the culture, right? And you don't have that opportunities for people to work together, whether it's remote or in person. And some cultures are more in person, and you don't really know that until you join, right? So
Yeah, it's almost like you have to evangelize for yourself as you are explaining the role in a way, and help see the other person's. I imagine with time you will get to see what each stakeholder is looking for and how they are working, or what's really impactful for them. But in the beginning, if it's all on you and you're the one who has to do this across the organization, that can be a bit daunting and overwhelming, and it will take time for you to understand each stakeholder's needs and wants. Now let's talk about the career paths into being a user experience researcher. I think there are some fascinating, for me, one thing that stands out, or that feels like there's like this bi-directional probably road or superhighway, is someone in the product position that would go to a UX researcher position, and then vice versa. Have you seen that? And what are some other ways that you've seen people come into this position?
yeah, I mean, product management and user experience researchers are very similar in that they're very collaborative and need to stay really close to the users of a product and like drive the direction in terms of like the vision and strategy for a product. But I think there's so some like, rough paths I would say is like I could start with mine, right? It's like let's say you're a PhD in either like a social scientist, or you could be like a neuroscientist, like, or you could be an anthropologist, or, from a range of different backgrounds, right? And maybe you've been working on like policy research that has impact, that's changed something, right? Like, so I got to work on homelessness and got to do work that impacted on that. And so that sort of helped me to transition into like industry, right? And then in terms of like another path I would see is like people who are very focused on like human computer interaction. So like very like human factors focused. It makes me think of like kind of like a Stanford person. They go into industry, and then a third path I would say is like you could even be a designer. So because designers do like a lot of work, especially UX design, of like understanding like user flows and like, the product. And so they're like, you see a lot of roles like design researcher roles. And I've also noticed a lot of roles want you to be both a designer and a researcher. So that's interesting. And then, yeah, you could be in marketing as well, because again, that gets into like using some of the methods to understand audience. And I think maybe for this, for engineers, I've definitely met people who used to be engineers that like switched into UX. So there's definitely like a range of different paths.
I could see the value in a marketer wanting to do this or coming into this, because if you are able and it's almost like, the way that I look at it is, how there's sometimes politicians that will go and work for the big companies that are paying them when they're a politician, and then all of a sudden they retire from being a politician and then they go and sit on the board of one of these big companies. I see that with like the value of being a marketer and then going and being a UX researcher and then going back to being a marketer type thing would be huge, because you go and you're trying to speak to the audience, you're trying to understand what hits, and if you ideally are learning different marketing chops and the nuts and bolts of just doing marketing, that's great. But it doesn't matter if you don't truly understand the customer. And so that's why I could see the value in being a user experience researcher, understanding the customer, and then going back and like leveling up if you ever wanted to go back into marketing, assuming you're in the same field or the same space as you go through these different positions.
Yeah. And something with the engineers too, like I noticed there's a few that I've met that are like having their own consultancies, like with AI, like helping companies to figure out how they're going to implement AI. And I've noticed that some of them are like, oh, wow, I'm realizing that like this project actually like could really use someone on the UX side as I'm figuring out like and implementing like what this client wants. And so that could also be like a potential point of like collaboration. Like if you have your own company as a consultant and you're like, you might notice that like people are asking you questions that are very like UX like.
There is a little bit tangentially related to that. There's so much more than the tech when it comes to the user experience. And we kind of touched on that before, but the user experience, maybe you can break down all the different areas that aren't tech that still are part of the user experience.
So like not the infra, but like what would make a good experience beyond.
Yeah, exactly. Not the exact like, oh yeah, you can deploy this and then it creates low latency, but how does that actually look when I'm just thinking about, for example, in this consultancy issue, where it would be nice to have somebody that is a user experience part. And there's a whole lot that goes into, I guess it could be solved with tech, but I'm trying not to be like technocentric on it. But there's a whole lot of just like the human aspect of, hey, we are keeping the client updated on how we're moving and where we're going and what we're doing. And we're also making sure that these things are checked off, like the visibility and the communication. And those are some things that come to mind, the transparency of the project.
Yeah. I mean, getting into like staying in communication with folks and the reporting and like it reminds me of like having like dashboards and like showing things like visually to folks of like what's going on is like definitely something you could collaborate on. I think in terms of like getting back to the question of like what's a good experience, I think like some like measures that people use are things like getting back to, again, like it's pretty like kind of like core things are like satisfaction, ease of use, what are the pain points I feel like, and how can we improve. I think if you have those like 4 pieces, that's like a good place to start if you haven't done it before. And I think what you said also of like making things people centric, like in the case of being like a consultant in AI, yes, you have to keep both your client as a person human centric, but also what they're actually making themselves. And you have to have a knowledge of like, all right, my client wants to implement this AI for, again, I'll just go back to the HR thing, but they don't really like have a like clear understanding of like their use cases or people's needs. And that's like exactly what UX research does, is like our role is to advocate for people so that things are built around them and that AI is people centric. Like that's sort of the core of it, right? Because without that, ultimately, like long-term things will fail, right? You'll implement, you'll think that short-term things are working, but then you might have backlash, right? And a lot of companies and, that are more well-known know like how the damage to their brand that can happen, right? Like if you roll something out and people have a bad experience with like, let's say Gemini or something, it's going to be all over the news, right?
Shit.
So being able to like have the foresight and like have a long-term view is also super important there.
The thing that you said 4 kind of pillars there that I wanted to write down, but I didn't catch them all. It was satisfaction, ease of use.
What are the pain points and like what are the areas to improve?
Have you seen folks that are not user experience researchers still go out there and do this type of research? Because it's almost like it's not necessarily that their position is calling upon them to do it, but they see the need, and before they go and they invest or they make a decision to invest all this time and energy into building out an ML platform or building out or hiring teams and then choosing a centralized way of using a platform, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just trying to like bring it back to what engineers probably will do. It feels like this can be done by engineering teams, and this is almost like a new tool in their tool belt as they're trying to think through some of these hard decisions and recognizing, oh yeah, like you said, it's not the most comfortable, but we could get some signal in a week and maybe we can really dive into knowing that we make the right decision here.
Yeah, I mean, engineers definitely can and do that. And also, I think like when you were talking, founders came to mind, right? Because if you're starting your own company, right, you're going to be really, I mean, I might be generalizing, but what I've seen is like you might be really, really focused on like having the best possible products. And a big part of that is talking to people. So I've had people who are, founded a company and they want like feedback, right? And they're reaching out and they want to talk. And so you see a lot of that as well. Because they know their companies aren't going to be successful if they haven't like gotten a sense of like their market and how they could be positioning themselves.
Yes. Awesome. Well, I am so glad that we did this. The whole reason that I find this fascinating is for that very fact, is that I've heard too many people come on here and say, we built a great product internally and we launched it to crickets. And really, it feels like some of these tips and tricks on becoming a better researcher and understanding the pain points and the ease of use can be ways that you will avoid these problems. Because if people are not using your tool, there's a few reasons that could be for, right? Like it could be that you just didn't do a good enough job letting them know that the tool is there. So you have an awareness problem. Or it could be because the tool sucks. And so nobody wants to use it because when they use it, it's like, this is a lot harder than when I do it on my own. And so for that problem, the tool sucks. This is a great way to counterbalance that.
Yeah, I agree.
Is there anything else? Like, I know that we had thought about talking about developer experience and how we apply everything to developer experience. Is that like, do you feel like there's things that you want to touch on there?
I think what I had planned to talk about was really like, you're just taking all of what we talked about and applying that specifically to developer focused tools and also like their experiences, for example, like both in just their careers or at the organization they're working at, and I'm really understanding people's needs. And I think that Google does a pretty good job of that with Dora. They have a team that's like, they publish their annual report and they're really focused on that developer experience. And I think it's a good resource. I linked it into the doc I shared with you. Because that's another area too of like, if let's say you're an engineering manager and you're trying to think of ways of like mitigating pain points for your team, like you could do like an internal, like you could actually do that internally, right? And do like a developer experience research and do like a survey throughout your company and understand like, hey, okay, most of my team uses this. So a gap here is that we need to have more support for learning like this other tool if we want to switch, or like, people aren't feeling that great about this thing. This is a solution that I can do to support my team. So I think that's another important piece that could support developer teams as well.
God, as you say that, it's so true. Hopefully every engineering manager is doing this, but taking the time to survey, especially if you have big teams or you have a big engineering organization, to recognize where pain points are for the teams. And that's where you can spend your energy and focus. It's if there's signals coming out of a survey saying, oh yeah, we're spending a lot of time because we're always having to go back and fix the data quality. It's like, maybe we should start figuring out how we can get better data governance, right? Or if we are spending a lot of time, or there's a lot of pain because the open source tools that we're using on our ML platform are not reliable or doing something. Oh, should we maybe look at how to fix that? And so, yeah, doing this research from a managerial perspective or a leadership perspective, it just feels like something that should and hopefully is constantly happening.
Exactly.